A quiet afternoon in the park turns into an unexpected encounter when a young girl in an electric scooter crosses paths with a legendary figure. But when trouble rolls in, the balance shifts, and what happens next will leave you speechless. Is justice still alive in a world where strength is often mistaken for power? Watch till the end to find out. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Let us know in the comments, what would you do in this situation? The park near the hospital was a quiet place, filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional laughter of children playing on the grass. The paved pathways were lined with benches where patients and visitors often sat, soaking in the fresh air. Doctors and nurses frequently recommended that those recovering from injuries or surgeries take strolls here, letting nature aid in their healing. The park had become a routine stop for many who were learning to adjust to new limitations, and one of them was a young girl named Camila. Camila maneuvered her electric scooter along the pathway, weaving carefully between joggers and dog walkers. Her hands gripped the controls tightly, her expression neutral as she passed by a group of children playing with a soccer ball. She didn't stop to watch them, though she felt the familiar pang in her chest. She remembered when she had been just like them, running, jumping, racing on her scooter with the wind whipping against her face. But that was before. The doctors had told her mother that getting outside would be good for her, that fresh air would help not only her body, but also her mind. But no amount of sunlight or gentle breezes could change the reality she lived with now. She wasn't like those kids anymore. She never would be again. She reached a clearing near a fountain and slowed her scooter, parking herself beside an empty bench. She wasn't alone in the park, but she felt isolated all the same. Everything had changed after the accident. She had lost more than just the use of her legs. She had lost a part of herself. The fearless, fast-moving girl she had been was now trapped in a body that no longer responded to her the way she wanted it to. She didn't cry about it anymore. There was no point. She had long since accepted that life wasn't fair, but that didn't mean she liked it. She adjusted the settings on her scooter, making sure the battery was still holding up. She couldn't afford for it to die while she was out here alone. Though the hospital wasn't far, she hated the idea of being stranded, having to ask for help. As she checked the screen on her scooter, her eyes caught sight of an older man sitting on a nearby bench, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady as he surveyed the park. He wore a denim jacket and a cowboy hat, his rugged face carrying a calmness that stood out from the usual park-goers. Camila blinked. He looked familiar. She stared for a moment longer before realization hit her. No way. It couldn't be. She turned her scooter slightly, rolling a bit closer before speaking. Are you Chuck Norris?" The man turned his head slightly, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "So they say." Camila's mouth fell open slightly. She wasn't the type to get starstruck. She had never cared much about celebrities, but this was different. This wasn't just some actor. This was Chuck Norris, the man who could take down 10 bad guys in one move, the man who, according to the internet, could make onions cry, the living legend, and he was sitting right here, in her park. She narrowed her eyes slightly. No way. Prove it. Chuck raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. How exactly would I do that? Camila crossed her arms. Do something cool. Chuck exhaled through his nose in amusement. He looked around the park, then leaned forward slightly, tapping his fingers against the wooden bench. What's your definition of cool? Camila hesitated. She wasn't sure what she expected him to do. Flip over the fountain? Punch a tree down? After a pause, she shrugged. I don't know. You're Chuck Norris? Isn't everything you do cool? Chuck chuckled, shaking his head slightly. That's what the internet says. But you can't believe everything you read. Camila smirked. Except the part where you can beat anyone in a fight, right? Chuck tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he looked back at her with a calm expression. Winning isn't the point. Justice is. Camila's smirk faded. There was something in his tone, something solid, something real. She looked away, rolling her scooter forward slightly. Justice, huh? Guess that only works if people actually care. Chuck studied her. Something tells me you've got a story behind that. Camila hesitated. She had never been one to spill her personal business to strangers. But this wasn't just anyone. This was Chuck Norris. She took a breath. I used to be the fastest kid in school. Chuck remained silent, listening. Camila kept her eyes on the fountain as she spoke. I had an electric scooter. Well, not this one, my old one. It was lighter, faster. I was good, really good. I won every race. Did all the best tricks. I was unbeatable. She exhaled slowly. But not everyone liked that. Chuck didn't interrupt, didn't push her to explain. He just waited. Camila swallowed hard. One day, there was a big race at my school. I made it to the finals. It was supposed to be a fair match, just me and one other person. But when I was in midair, right at the peak of my jump, someone shoved me. Her hands gripped the armrests of her scooter, knuckles turning white. I hit the ground wrong, really wrong. She didn't need to explain the rest. The cast, the surgeries, the doctors shaking their heads. The words, "You'll never walk again," echoing in her mind. Chuck's face remained unreadable, but his eyes sharpened. And the one who did it? Camila let out a bitter laugh. Oh, he got away with it. No one did anything. He said it was an accident, and that was that. No punishment, no consequences. He's probably still out there living his life like nothing happened. Silence stretched between them. Chuck leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against the bench. And what do you think about that? Camila's jaw clenched. I think it's garbage. Chuck nodded slowly. That's because it is. Camila turned her head toward him. Yeah? So what would you have done? Chuck exhaled, his gaze thoughtful. Sometimes the world isn't fair, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting. Camila scoffed. Fighting? What do you think I'm supposed to do? Roundhouse kick him from my scooter? Chuck chuckled, but there was something serious in his eyes. Fighting isn't always about fists. It's about knowing who you are. It's about standing your ground. And sometimes it's about knowing when to remind people that actions have consequences. Camila looked away, her thoughts tangled. Before she could say anything, the sound of motorcycles rumbled in the distance. She stiffened immediately. Chuck followed her gaze toward the edge of the park, where 3 men in leather jackets pulled up on roaring bikes. Camila's hands gripped the sides of her scooter. Her stomach twisted. Not them again. Chuck glanced back at her. Friends of yours? Camila swallowed hard. I wish they weren't. The rumble of motorcycles filled the park as the 3 bikers slowed their approach, their engines growling like distant thunder before they cut them off. The moment their boots hit the pavement, a wave of unease spread through the park. People sitting on benches looked away. Some parents subtly pulled their children closer, and a few joggers altered their routes to avoid crossing paths with the newcomers. Camila felt her chest tighten as she adjusted her position on her electric scooter, her fingers gripping the controls instinctively. She knew these guys. She had seen them enough times to recognize their arrogant smirks and the way they carried themselves like they owned the place. The leader, a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and a thick tattoo crawling up his neck, took the first step forward. His dark eyes scanned the park before locking on to Camila. A smirk tugged at his lips. Well, well, look who's here again, rolling round in our park like she owns the place. His voice was sharp, taunting, the kind that made Camila's stomach turn. Behind him, his two buddies chuckled. One was stockier, with a scruffy beard and a deep scar running down his cheek, while the other was lanky, with multiple piercings lining his ears and a cigarette dangling from his lips. They weren't just here to hang out, they were here for her, again. Camila forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She refused to let them see her flinch. "It's not your park," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves coiling in her gut. The bald leader chuckled, exchanging a glance with his friends before stepping closer. "You sure about that? 'Cause last I checked, you're the only one in a set of wheels that doesn't have an engine." The scarred biker leaned in slightly, inspecting her electric scooter with mock interest. "Still riding this thing? You'd think they'd at least upgrade you to something with some real speed after your little accident." Camila's hands tightened around the armrests of her scooter. She could feel the heat rising in her face, but she refused to look away. "I don't need speed to get away from guys like you," she said coldly. The lanky biker exhaled a cloud of smoke through his nostrils, laughing. "Oh, I like this one. She's got some fight in her." Camila was ready to snap back, but before she could, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Funny thing about fights," Chuck Norris said, standing up from the bench at a measured pace. "They don't always go the way you expect." The shift in the air was immediate. The bikers turned to look at him, and for a second, their smirks faltered. It was subtle, but Camila caught it. A flicker of uncertainty. Chuck stood relaxed, his thumbs hooked into his belt, his face unreadable. The bald leader eyed him up and down before scoffing. "And who the hell are you, cowboy?" Chuck tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "Just someone who doesn't like seeing people act tough around kids." The lanky biker squinted at him, his cigarette bobbing slightly as he spoke. "Wait a minute. Isn't this that guy from those old movies?" The scarred biker frowned. "No way. Chuck Norris?" He studied Chuck again, narrowing his eyes. "Man, he's just some old dude." The bald leader grinned, regaining some of his earlier confidence. "Oh, I get it. You're trying to play the hero, huh?" He cracked his knuckles. "Listen, Grandpa, why don't you mind your own business before you get hurt?" Chuck exhaled slowly, unbothered by the threats. He turned slightly, giving Camila a sidelong glance. "You believe these guys?" he asked, his voice laced with something between amusement and disappointment. Camila shook her head. "They're idiots." Chuck smiled. "That's what I thought." He looked back at the bikers, his expression unreadable. "You know, I was hoping for a quiet day, but it looks like that's not in the cards." The bald leader's smirk faded slightly. Something about the way Chuck spoke, the way he stood there completely unfazed, was starting to chip away at his arrogance. "Listen, old man, I don't know who you think you are, but we don't take orders from random has-beens." Chuck took a single step forward, and for the first time the bikers actually stiffened. It wasn't a big movement. It wasn't a flashy threat. But there was something about the way he did it, something controlled and calculated, that sent a chill through the air. Camila saw it now. Chuck wasn't just some actor. He wasn't playing a role. This was real. Chuck lifted a hand and slowly removed his cowboy hat, dusting it off casually. "You boys have 3 options," he said evenly. 1, you can turn around and leave before you embarrass yourselves. The scarred biker scoffed. "Yeah? And what's option 2? Chuck's gaze darkened slightly. "You find out exactly how fast I can put you on the ground." The lanky biker's cigarette nearly fell from his mouth. "And, what's the 3rd option?" Chuck put his hat back on and shrugged. "You could always apologize and buy the girl an ice cream." The bald leader's nostrils flared. His pride had taken a hit, and it was clear he wasn't going to let this old man talk down to him in front of everyone. "You're making a big mistake," he growled. Chuck's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "That's funny," he said. "I was about to tell you the same thing." The bald leader snapped. "Get him!" The scarred biker lunged first, his thick arms swinging toward Chuck in a wide punch. Camila barely had time to blink before Chuck moved. With a single step to the side, he avoided the punch effortlessly, grabbing the biker's wrist in the same motion. Then, with no visible effort, he twisted his arm downward and sent him crashing to the pavement. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and he groaned as he clutched his shoulder. The lanky biker hesitated, but the bald leader shoved him forward. "What the hell are you waiting for?" The lanky biker rushed forward, trying to throw a kick, but Chuck caught his leg midair and swept his supporting foot out from under him. He crashed onto his back, gasping. Camila's mouth was slightly open in shock. Chuck turned his attention back to the bald leader, who was suddenly reconsidering his options. Chuck cracked his knuckles. "Last chance." The bald leader snarled, reaching into his jacket. "I don't fight fair, old man." Camila's breath caught in her throat as she saw the unmistakable glint of a knife. But Chuck didn't even blink. The moment the blade cleared the jacket, Chuck's hand shot out like lightning, gripping the leader's wrist. There was a flicker of movement, a subtle twist of the wrist, a shift of pressure, and suddenly the knife was clattering to the ground. Chuck kicked it away and released the biker's arm, letting him stumble back. The bald leader's face turned red with anger, but before he could react, Chuck leaned in slightly and said, in a voice only he could hear, "Run." And he did. All 3 bikers scrambled to their feet, tripping over themselves as they bolted for their motorcycles. As the engines roared back to life and the bikers sped off without a second glance, Camila exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Chuck dusted off his hands, then turned back to her as if nothing had happened. Camila stared at him. "What was that?" Chuck smirked. "Just a reminder." Camila let out a short laugh, shaking her head. She didn't know what was crazier, the fact that she had just witnessed Chuck Norris take down 3 grown men in under a minute, or the fact that for the first time in a long time, she actually felt safe. The park slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, though a few lingering glances were cast in Chuck's direction. Camila remained in her scooter, her fingers still gripping the armrests as she replayed what had just happened. The bikers had come in with their usual arrogance, believing they could intimidate her like always, but this time it had been different. This time they had picked a fight with the wrong person. She turned to Chuck, studying him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He looked completely unfazed, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He adjusted his jacket and sat back down on the bench, exhaling softly. Camila frowned. "You don't even look tired," she said, half in amazement. Chuck glanced at her with a small smile. "Why would I be?" Camila shook her head. "You just took down 3 guys in like 30 seconds. Chuck lifted a shoulder in a casual shrug. "They weren't exactly challenging." Camila let out a breath and leaned back slightly in her scooter. "I've seen them harass other people before," she admitted. "Nobody ever stands up to them. Most people just ignore them or walk the other way." Chuck nodded slowly. "That's the problem. Bullies rely on fear. The moment someone stands up to them, they crumble." Camila scoffed. "Well, yeah, but it's not like most people are Chuck Norris." Chuck chuckled. "You don't have to be me to stand up for yourself." Camila stared at him. "That's easy for you to say. You're—" She gestured vaguely at him. "You're you. I'm just some kid in a scooter." Chuck's gaze sharpened slightly. "And?" Camila frowned. "And what?" Chuck leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You think strength comes from being able to throw a punch?" Camila hesitated. "Well, yeah." Chuck shook his head. "That's only one kind of strength. There's a much more important kind. The strength to keep going, even when things don't go your way." Camila looked away, her fingers tightening on her armrests. "I don't know about that," she muttered. Chuck studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me something. Why do they keep coming after you?" Camila scoffed. "Because they're jerks." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "Maybe. But jerks don't waste their time on people who don't matter to them." Camila shifted uncomfortably. "What are you saying?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. "I'm saying they wouldn't keep bothering you if they didn't think you were worth their attention." Camila blinked. That wasn't what she had expected him to say. She had always thought of herself as an easy target, someone they could pick on because she couldn't fight back. But Chuck was suggesting something different. Chuck continued, his voice steady. "Bullies pick on people they see as a threat. Maybe they don't even realize it themselves. But somewhere deep down, they know you won't just roll over and take it. And that bothers them." Camila let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, real scary. A kid who can't even stand." Chuck's expression remained calm, but there was something firm in his gaze. A kid who refuses to back down. Camila swallowed. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She had never let them see her afraid. Even when they mocked her, she had fired back. Even when they tried to intimidate her, she had held her ground. She had thought she was powerless, but maybe, just maybe, she had been stronger than she realized. A quiet breeze passed through the park, rustling the leaves overhead. For the first time in a long time, Camila felt something stir inside her, something that had been buried beneath frustration and anger for months. She turned back to Chuck. "So, what now?" Chuck smiled slightly. Now you decide what kind of person you want to be." Camila exhaled. That was easier said than done. Before she could respond, movement caught her eye. The bikers were back. Camila's stomach clenched as she spotted them at the far end of the park, standing near their motorcycles. They weren't coming back towards her, not yet, but she could see the way they huddled together, talking in low voices. One of them glanced in her direction, his expression unreadable. Chuck followed her gaze, his face unreadable. "They didn't learn their lesson," he murmured. Camila swallowed hard. "They're probably mad. You embarrassed them." Chuck nodded. "Good." Camila glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "Good?" Chuck leaned back against the bench, crossing his arms. "Bullies don't forget humiliation. If they're angry, it means they're scared. They're trying to figure out how to take back control." Camila frowned. "So, what do we do?" Chuck exhaled, his eyes locked on the bikers. We wait. Camila wasn't sure how she felt about that answer, but something about the way Chuck said it made her believe that whatever happened next, he was ready. The bikers didn't come back right away, but Camila could feel their presence like a storm cloud hovering at the edge of the park. They stood near their motorcycles, gesturing as they talked, their faces tense with frustration. Every few minutes, one of them would glance in her direction, then back at his friends, as if debating what to do next. Chuck remained seated beside her, completely unbothered, his posture relaxed. Camila, on the other hand, could feel the tension creeping into her shoulders. She had no doubt that they weren't finished. They weren't just going to let this go. "They're trying to decide if they're brave enough to come back," Chuck murmured. Camila exhaled. "And if they are?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. "Then they'll have a bad day." Camila smirked despite herself, but her stomach still twisted with unease. She wasn't afraid of them, not exactly, but she knew how people like them thought. They had been humiliated, and guys like that didn't let things go easily. They'd want revenge. Minutes passed. Camila pretended to check her scooter's settings, but her attention never left the bikers. Finally, the bald leader seemed to come to a decision. He said something to his friends, and all three of them turned back toward her and Chuck. Camila's pulse sped up. "Here we go." Chuck didn't move. The bikers approached more cautiously this time. Their confidence from earlier had been replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. Camila could see it in their expressions. They weren't here to talk. The bald leader stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed. His two lackeys flanked him, their postures tense. "You think you're funny, old man?" the leader said, his voice lower now, filled with barely restrained anger. "You think you can just make fools out of us and walk away?" Chuck met his gaze evenly. "Yes." Camila had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. The way Chuck said it, so calm, so completely sure, made the bikers stiffen. The scarred biker sneered. "You got lucky back there." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" The lanky biker shifted, glancing around the park. Fewer people were around now. The joggers had cleared out, the families had moved further away. He probably thought that meant they had the upper hand. The leader took a step forward. "You think you're tough, huh?" Chuck exhaled, almost like he was bored. "No." He tilted his head. "But I know you're not." The leader's face darkened. That was the final straw. He lunged. Camila barely had time to register what was happening before Chuck moved. It was fast. 1 second, the biker was charging, his fist swinging forward. The next, Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, caught his wrist, and twisted. The bald man let out a sharp cry of pain as he was pulled forward, his momentum sending him crashing onto his knees. Chuck held his arm firm. "That was your last mistake." The scarred biker rushed in next. Chuck didn't hesitate. He let go of the leader's arm and met the second attacker with a sharp, precise elbow strike to the chest. The impact sent the man stumbling backward, gasping for breath. Before he could recover, Chuck stepped forward and swept his legs out from under him, sending him flat onto the pavement. The lanky biker hesitated. His eyes darted between his two downed friends and Chuck, who was still completely composed, his breathing even. Chuck adjusted his sleeves. "You're thinking about running." The lanky biker's jaw clenched. "I don't run." Chuck nodded. "Then you're thinking about making the same mistake they did." For a moment, the biker just stood there, fists clenched. Camila saw the exact moment the realization hit him, when he finally understood that there was no winning this fight. He took a step back, then another. Chuck smirked. "Good choice." The bald leader groaned, clutching his arm as he struggled to get up. "This isn't over," he spat. Chuck's eyes narrowed. He took one slow step forward, and the man instantly flinched. Chuck stopped, tilting his head. "Yes, it is." For a few seconds, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then, without another word, the bikers turned and hurried back toward their motorcycles. They climbed on, their movement stiff with pain and humiliation. The engines roared to life, and within moments they were gone. Camila let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Chuck turned back to her, his expression as calm as ever. "Well," he said, "that was predictable." Camila let out a stunned laugh. "Are you serious? You just—" She gestured at the empty space where the bikers had been. "You just wrecked them. Again." Chuck gave a small shrug. "They wrecked themselves." Camila shook her head. "That was insane." She hesitated. "But kind of awesome." Chuck smiled slightly. "Good." Camila looked down at her hands, her fingers still gripping the armrests of her scooter. Her heart was still racing, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The park was quiet again. The bikers were gone, their engines fading into the distance, but their presence still lingered in Camila's mind. She had seen them harass people before. She had been their target for months. But today was different. Today, they lost. They didn't just lose a fight. They lost their power, their control. They came in expecting to intimidate, to dominate, but they had left humiliated. Chuck had barely broken a sweat, and now, for the first time, Camila wasn't afraid of them coming back. She looked over at him. He was sitting back on the bench like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just taken down 3 grown men in a matter of seconds. His breathing was steady. His hands rested casually on his knees. It was surreal. "You didn't even hesitate," she said, still processing everything. Chuck glanced at her, then shrugged. "Why would I?" Camila let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Because they could have had more guys? Because one of them had a knife?" She paused. "Because normal people don't just get into fights in the middle of a park?" Chuck exhaled slowly. "You don't always get to pick your fights." Camila thought about that. She had never had a choice in hers. She hadn't asked to be shoved off her scooter, to have her legs taken from her. She hadn't asked for those bikers to turn her into their favorite target. The world had forced these fights on her. Chuck continued, his voice calm but firm. "When trouble comes to you, you have 2 choices. You can let it happen, or you can make sure it doesn't happen again." Camila hesitated. "And how do you do that?" Chuck turned slightly to face her, his expression unreadable. "You start by realizing you're not powerless." Camila scoffed, gesturing to her scooter. "Yeah, sure, real powerful." Chuck studied her for a moment. "Do you think power is in your legs?" Camila frowned. "Kind of, yeah." Chuck shook his head. "No, power is in your choices." Camila crossed her arms. "And what choice do I have? I can't fight like you." Chuck nodded slowly. "Maybe not, but you've already been fighting longer than most people ever will." Camila stared at him, confused. Chuck leaned forward. "You didn't let what happened to you break you. You didn't let those guys make you afraid. Even before I showed up, you stood your ground. You never ran." Camila looked away. "I didn't have a choice." Chuck's voice was quiet but strong. "You always have a choice. And you chose to stay strong." Camila didn't know what to say to that. She had never thought about it that way before. She had always seen herself as someone who had been knocked down, someone who had lost. But Chuck was saying she had already won just by refusing to let the world take more from her. She swallowed. So, what now? Chuck sat back, tilting his head. That's up to you. Camila exhaled slowly. She had spent so much time feeling stuck, feeling like she had no control. But maybe Chuck was right. Maybe she still had a choice. Before she could respond, she noticed movement in the park. A group of kids had gathered near a small basketball court, passing a ball between them. They were laughing, calling out plays, shooting hoops. For a moment, Camila felt a familiar ache in her chest. She used to play. Before the accident, before everything changed, she had been fast on the court, weaving between players, sinking shots from impossible angles. She used to love the game, but that was over now. Chuck followed her gaze, then looked back at her. You used to play? Camila hesitated before nodding. Yeah, before. Chuck studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he stood up. Let's go. Camila blinked. Go where? Chuck gestured toward the court. Time to get back in the game. Camila's stomach twisted. That's not funny. Chuck's expression didn't change. Who's joking? Camila let out a nervous laugh. In case you forgot, I can't run anymore. Chuck nodded. So what? Camila frowned. So what? That kind of matters, don't you think? Chuck crossed his arms. You ever heard of wheelchair basketball? Camila hesitated. Yeah, but... Chuck cut her off. No buts. You're either a player or you're not. Camila opened her mouth, then closed it. She wanted to argue, to list all the reasons why this was a stupid idea. But she didn't. Because deep down, she knew exactly what Chuck was doing. He wasn't just talking about basketball. He was talking about her choices, her future. Camila looked at the court again. The kids were still playing, laughing, completely unaware of the conversation happening nearby. She had a choice. She took a slow breath. Then she reached down, adjusted the settings on her scooter, and started rolling toward the court. Chuck smiled. Good call. Camila's heart pounded as she approached the basketball court, her hands tightening on the armrests of her scooter. The laughter of the kids playing echoed in her ears, bringing back memories she had tried to bury. She used to be out there with them, running, dribbling, moving faster than anyone else. But that was before. Now she was rolling toward the court in a machine that carried her because her legs no longer could. Chuck walked beside her, his pace unhurried, his presence steady. He hadn't said anything since she started moving toward the court. He didn't need to. She knew this was her decision. He had simply given her the opportunity. The kids playing hadn't noticed her yet. They were focused on their game, passing the ball back and forth, calling out plays. Camila felt a flicker of longing, then doubt, then fear. What if they laughed? What if they told her to leave? What if she just made a fool of herself? She stopped a few feet from the court, suddenly unsure. Chuck stopped too, watching her. She turned to him, her voice quiet. What if I can't do it? Chuck studied her for a moment, then shrugged. What if you can? Camila let out a breath, glancing at the court again. The kids still hadn't noticed her. She could turn around right now. She could leave, pretend she never tried. But something inside her refused. Before she could overthink it, she took a deep breath and rolled forward onto the court. The game slowed as the players noticed her. A boy, about her age, wearing a faded jersey, lowered the ball. He blinked at her, surprised. Hey? Camila hesitated. Hey? Another kid, a tall girl with a ponytail, glanced at her scooter. You lost or something? Camila forced herself not to shrink back. No, I used to play here. The boy raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What happened? Camila swallowed. She could feel Chuck watching, waiting. This was her moment. She squared her shoulders. I got hurt, but I still know how to play. Silence. The kids exchanged glances. Camila braced herself for rejection for the moment where they told her she couldn't. Then the boy with the jersey spun the ball in his hands. You any good? Camila smirked. Try me. He bounced the ball toward her. She caught it instinctively, feeling the familiar grip beneath her fingers. It had been so long, but the muscle memory was still there. She took a breath, adjusted her position, and aimed. The ball left her hands in a perfect arc. It soared through the air and swished cleanly through the hoop. For a moment, there was silence. Then someone let out a low whistle. The tall girl grinned. Okay, not bad. The boy nodded. You're in. Camila exhaled, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Chuck smiled from the sideline. Told you. She shot him a look. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Chuck chuckled. Maybe a little. Camila rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was back in the game. Camila played for the first time in what felt like forever. The ball moved between her hands as she passed, aimed, and shot, her body adjusting to the scooter's movements in ways she never had to before. It wasn't the same as running across the court, wasn't the same as weaving between players with effortless speed, but it was still basketball. It was still the game she loved. The other kids quickly adapted, figuring out how to work her into their plays. At first, they hesitated, unsure of how much she could do, but after her third clean shot, they stopped treating her like someone different. She was just another player. The boy in the faded jersey passed her the ball again. Go for it! Camila gripped it, wheeled herself into position, and took the shot. The ball arched high, spinning in the air before dropping through the net with a satisfying swish. A cheer went up. Camila let out a breath, a real smile spreading across her face. She had forgotten how good this felt. Chuck leaned against the fence, watching with a knowing look. He hadn't said much after she had joined the game. He didn't need to. The game lasted another 15 minutes before the kids started getting tired. One by one, they drifted off, calling out goodbyes as they left the court. Camila rolled toward the edge, her heart still racing from the rush of playing again. Chuck met her with his usual calm expression. How was it? Camila let out a breath, still catching up with herself. It was... She paused, searching for the right words. It was good. Chuck nodded. Told you. Camila smirked. Yeah, you were right. Chuck crossed his arms. So, what's next? Camila hesitated. That question used to terrify her. She had spent so much time feeling stuck, convinced that her future had been stolen from her the moment she hit the ground. But now she wasn't so sure. She thought about the way she had played, how natural it had felt even in a scooter. She thought about the way the other kids had accepted her, not because they felt sorry for her, but because she had proven she could keep up. Maybe she wasn't done. Maybe she didn't have to be. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and hovered over a number she hadn't called in a long time, her old basketball coach. Chuck glanced at the screen. Good call. Camila took a breath and pressed the call button. As the phone rang in her ear, she glanced up at Chuck. You're leaving, aren't you? Chuck gave her a small smile. I was just passing through. Camila nodded slowly. She had known from the beginning that he wouldn't be here forever. She wasn't sad, not really, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The call connected. Camila sat up straighter. "Coach, it's Camila. I want to play again." Chuck nodded once, tipping his hat before turning away. Camila watched him go, feeling lighter than she had in months. She had lost a lot, but she wasn't done fighting. She was back in the game, and this time, she wasn't going anywhere. What just happened proves one thing. True strength isn't about fists or fear. It's about standing up even when the odds are against you. In a world where injustice exists, sometimes all it takes is one person to remind us that we're never truly powerless. If this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss more powerful stories like this. And tell us in the comments, what lesson did you take from this story?